My name is Renee. Welcome to Detours in Archaeology, and this is an Archaeologist commentary of The Mummy Returns, Part 2. Let's get right into it with the scepter.
In the first movie and this movie, the scepter with the little star on top, which I don't actually understand that symbolism, but it was at Havanaptra in the treasure hoard. Why or how did it get there if it was so closely tied to the Scorpion King's defeat? You'd think that in the story, especially before parts of it get lost, because that's always what happens to mythology and stories over time, that they know that a Magi, presumably, would have to use it to kill the Scorpion King. Also, we'll get to that. Wouldn't they have kept it with the other Scorpion King relics? Why is that a relic? Because that never showed up in the first part of the movie. I guess they didn't want to give away the end. What site were they at when they found the Scorpion King bracelet? Was it in Thebes? So, Cairo? It looked like it was a smaller, more deserted area, but it was supposed to be Thebes, but actually Cairo. But her past life was in Cairo with her father when he died, but it didn't look like Thebes/Cairo. They did just conflate them in the first movie. How did Anaxamoon know where Imhotep was? He isn't where he was initially buried, and how would she even have known that? She died before he did both times, and if it's the same soul, which does get more confusing when Imhotep does the ritual to bring Anaxamoon's soul back.
And I know this isn't history-based, but it confounds me, so...
How did she come back in the first movie for the short period of time if Anaxamoon was reincarnated as this other woman already? Did the living soul leave the body or travel to the underworld and do the whole spooky spectral thing and come back from the River of Souls? Which also isn't really an Egyptian thing. That's more of a Greek thing. The River Styx. And, Ardith Bey does say that he'll bring about the next apocalypse. What was the last one? What was the last apocalypse? It's like 7 days until the Scorpion King and the army of Anubis wipes out the world unless they can stop it. Sounds much more like a direct prophecy, because it wouldn't have started without the main character's intervention. Ardith Bey does say it's fate, so they don't shy away from it. And of course they need a ticking clock, so it has to be like 7 days, but it would take so much longer than 7 days just to get to Egypt. Because you have to take a boat. Again, I guess they could take a plane.
It could take 5 to 7 days if they use both overland rails and steamships, or 2.5 to 4 days taking airplanes, since they would routinely have to make stops and refuel and add water.
Bad guys want Imhotep to kill the Scorpion King, but he lost his powers and his immortality at the end of the last movie. So when they resurrect him, why does he get his powers back? But not all of his powers, though. Not his ability to bring the plagues of Egypt again. And the wake-up chant is different from the first movie, so that does make sense. I guess he's not cursed in the same way, so a different spell would be needed. So no plagues this time. But again, why magic? Why does he have his powers? The chant also wakes up a bunch of other mummies in the museum, which presumably present zero problems to the people who come into work the next morning. In case you didn't know, that was sarcasm. Ardith Bey says that. Khan responds, couldn't someone have given Rick the tattoo and then just taught him the response when he was a little kid? It's not a birthmark. Ardith Bey is Magi. Being a Magi requires a lot of discipline and training. The Magi were real guards in ancient Egypt, and in the movie they were bodyguards for the pharaoh, and they tried to keep the mummy dead. What have they been up to lately? Stopping grave robbers, hopefully. He could have just had it slapped on and made taught the chant. Doesn't mean that he's an actual Magi. And where did they ever find these people to do this cult stuff? That's always kind of weird to me too. I don't like that in the YouTube version they don't have the ancient Egyptian subtitles. No idea what he's saying to her. I don't remember what they were. Sometimes I remember, but mostly not. They're all looking at each other lovingly, and like, Fez just like, rolls his eyes and walks away. couple years ago. Yes, it's a joke about the 2 years between the movies. But it's like, Rick, dude, you have an 8-year-old son. And here's a little bit of math inaccuracy. You have an 8-year-old kid. It was 1926 when the first movie took place. So 1933 is a 7-year difference. It should be at least a 9-year difference. Someone didn't do the baby math correctly. Unless Evie already had a kid. On the train, in Imhotep's car, there are 5 canopic jars again, like in the first movie. This is wrong. There were only 4 sons of Horus represented on the tops of jars. There are 5 in the movie because they add a lion, which wasn't there. In the first movie, they say they cut out your heart, just like your other organs, and they put it into a jar. That is not true. They did not cut out your heart. Your heart was necessary to get into the afterlife. They left it in your body. The other organs, they did preserve in natron while they're preserving your body for 40 days, and they kept them in the canopic jars. They did take out your brain, though, because they thought your
Brain was worthless because they believed your soul, the Ka, Ba, and the other 7 of 9 parts, were housed in your heart. The brain was actually thought to be more of a mucus, which is why it wasn't even saved in a canopic jar.
So they're maybe a few miles away from the Great Pyramids when they're boarding the airship and taking off. It looks like it's the middle of the day. The shadows are basically right underneath the trees. In the next shot, they're going past the pyramids and it's sunset. How the heck did it take so long for them to pass, like, a few miles, maybe? Faster than she looks? Don't think so. Speaking of the airship, I really appreciate the eye on the bow, because the eye was a very traditional symbol of protection on ships. One, it was the symbol of like Horus or Ra, the Eye of Horus, the Eye of Ra, but it was also an early version of a figurehead on Phoenician and Greco-Roman ships that would make the ship look like a giant monster and presumably give protection while they're traveling the waves. Alex happens to pull the cord in the bathroom right at the time where they're passing Karnak. Did he know where they were when he pulled it? I don't think so. I think he just got lucky. The next scene, the bad guys and Alex arrive in Karnak, and there is a bit of weirdness when it comes to this.
At least in this scene.
It wouldn't have been abandoned. Like, when the bad guys get there, they show the giant pillars, which are accurate, sort of. They don't have the same bottom part with the stone stacks. And I can show pictures of what it actually does look like because I was there. I do appreciate that they have the hieroglyphs carved in rows because that is accurate. And later, they show the heroes getting there and they then have the columns with giant paintings on them, and that is not accurate. But Karnak would not have been abandoned, especially since it is right next to / in present-day Luxor. There's a whole city around it, and it's right near the Nile. Plus, the Valley of the Kings and Queens are also pretty close to Karnak, and is where a ton of archaeological work would have been currently going on in 1933. In fact, in the Valley of the Queens, 1933 was the year that Nefertari's tomb was made restricted to the public, so only archaeologists could go in. So they were actually doing work in there. And in the Valley of the Kings, there was still ongoing clearance of King Tut's tomb that was discovered back in 1922. Mostly, this was the year that Howard Carter published the final volume of his 3-volume set, titled The Tomb of Tutankhamen, discovered by the late Earl of Carnarvon and Howard Carter. And there was another book about 2 other mummies found in the tomb, which were Tut's unborn children, which was published by Douglas Derry. The airship is following the Nile, so they know how to get to Karnak. When Alex is shown the next flash of where he's supposed to go, the bracelet does actually seem to be showing the ancient appearance of Sardes. But how ancient? Karnak didn't exist when the pyramids were built, and the pyramids didn't exist yet in 5000 BCE when the Scorpion King died. Those are built at different times between 2700 BCE and 1700 BCE, which is like 1000 to 2000 years later. Plus, like I mentioned before, in the first flash they showed the pyramid stripped of the white stone outer layer, but those wouldn't have been stripped until later. We don't actually know when, but they were used to build other stuff. So they had a flash to the Temple of Isis on Philae, which wasn't actually built until the reign of Nectanebo I, who ruled from 380 to 362 BCE. It's like 2,500 years later. Nectanebo I's ancient royal titulary was
Necht-nebef.
and he became known as the founding pharaoh of the 13th and actually the last native dynasty after deposing, killing Nephrites II. But most of the ruins date from the Ptolemaic kingdom, especially during the reigns of
Ptolemy II, Philadelphus, Ptolemy V, Epiphanes, and Ptolemy VI.
282 to 145 BCE, with the Roman work added to Philae dedicated to Amun Osiris. I can just say that they were really jumping around on the timeline. How did they decide? I mean, the writers must have just picked them because they're famous spots in Egypt, but it makes no sense on the timeline. At least, in 1933, the Philae site was on the original island, but the Temple of Isis on the original island of Philae would have been partially flooded because of the building of the Aswan Low Dam, which was built in 1902. They would have had to go stomping around a very wet island, very wet set, but of course they didn't want to do that in the movie. But at least it would have been on the original island, because the entire site was drained and then systematically taken apart and rebuilt on the island of Agilkia in the 1960s before the new Aswan High Dam was completed in 1970. We get to the fight scene that we were shown a stela for at the beginning of the movie. There doesn't seem to be any examples of inscribed wall art showing two women fighting, and more specifically, using two daggers each. This doesn't necessarily mean that it didn't exist, but women weren't generally shown as fighting. They were shown dancing. One thing, when I was doing research, I found out that the daggers are also Hollywood inventions. They did have daggers. Real daggers just had a very different shape. They were generally wide-bladed, not like stiletto-shaped, and that wrist guard that's pointing outward is all wrong. I don't know where they got that design, but it does look cool. And if I'm wrong, correct me. I also wanted to know if the clothing was accurate. Like, did women basically wear bikinis and a wrap skirt? More so, did women fight? Especially with gymnastics, because they do flips in this scene. For the most part, no. If you look at the stela and paintings depicting women, they are shown dancing and performing acrobatics, so they might have been able to do gymnastics and flips and stuff, but they are usually wearing less. Many times, they're basically wearing a thong with a belt, necklaces, sometimes bracelets, and bands around the arms and bands around the legs. Other performers, like musicians or anything else, would and could wear more jewelry and full dresses. Some would wear sheer dresses, some not, and they could be long or short. But, I mean, they're fighting, so they have to be wearing less, but they can't show nudity. They can't show the other stuff in the movie, so they gotta add bikinis. On the throne in the background, kind of looks like Seti. Well, he's on a chair in front of the backdrop of two stela that are mirror reflections of each other, and they have young Horus basically looking at himself on both, because he has that braid on the side of his head. Whenever young Horus is depicted, the braid
is almost always
on the right side of the head.
But that can vary on some paintings in Stela because they only show the left side, and the braid identifies the character as Child Horus.
And above it, you have the Cobra goddess Wadjet's around the sun disk, Ra. And even though women wouldn't have been fighting very much, if at all, but for this movie, let's go with it, would fighters have worn masks? It seems kind of impractical, because it's harder to see what people are doing. But for the movie, maybe the masks were used to hide the sun devils. Even though they do take them off later as the reveal of who the fighters are. I really do like the jewelry that is shown in the movie, in the scene. Especially like Imhotep's necklace. He's wearing Khepri in gold. And the blue is presumably defiance. And the pharaoh is wearing the large eye of Horus or Ra with Nekhbut's and Wadjet. But he's only wearing the crown of Lower Egypt. And I guess if he's in Cairo, that makes sense. But he's supposed to be the king of both Upper and Lower Egypt. But I guess that's the choice made by the costume designers, because Seti I has been carved on walls wearing both the crown of Lower Egypt, the red crown, even though this one's gold, Deshret, even though at least one of his stelas shows him wearing the crown of Upper Egypt, which is the white crown, called Hedjet, or even the blue crown, Kepresh, which is a completely different shape. But that was mostly when he went into battle.
That we do not see in this movie.
But he was much more commonly depicted in the Nemes headdress that I mentioned earlier.
As mentioned in the previous episode with the Anubis warriors.
In the movie, Seti I has a tiny little bush of a beard, but in art, he was shown as either with no beard at all, or wearing the royal beard, which was a symbol of manhood in every sense of the word, and that is why Queen Hatshepsut depicted herself as wearing the beard, because she was saying that she was a king, she was pharaoh. So it was a symbol of pharaohness and of manhood. The king's costume does match stelas of pharaohs in tomb art, although they're usually depicted in white, but they could have different colors. The makeup on the women is so muted. The makeup is so muted on everyone in the movie, even the extras, and basically non-existent on the men. Even though in ancient Egypt, everyone would have worn makeup. It was part of a ritual and a way to honor the gods. For sake of argument, why would the two female stars' makeup be so muted? Because they're following very early 2000s style, late 90s style. Not brightly colored eyeshadow, very light amounts of eyeliner, and barely any lip color, and even gold. But ancient Egyptians wore bright blue eyeshadow, heavy liner, since it was made of kohl, K-O-H-L, and generally applied with the finger, so it would be a lot thicker, and it was useful. It protected against the sun, kind of like the lines on the cheeks of football players, kept the reflection of light from the sand out of their eyes, and it kept dust and bugs out of their eyes since it was a bit sticky. They'd also have red lips. Of course, these characters are fighting, but you'd think that they'd want the gods' favor for their fight. Their clothes, obviously made out of modern materials, it is a movie, but I can't even think of what materials they were kind of going for, because the Egyptians would have had linen, which is probably the best option in such a hot climate. And on Anaxinamun, I have no clue what the double circle brooch thing is supposed to look like. It doesn't match any symbol that I know of. They did have a lot of slightly thicker belts, so it does work. Just for the premise of the movie, Seti I did not have any children named Nefertiri. He either had 3 or 4 children, depending on the source. They had Ramses II, which would end up being Ramses the Great, Seti's successor. He had a daughter named Tia, who is his eldest daughter. He probably had another daughter called Henutmire, the younger sister, and actually became one of her brother's royal wives. Some historical records suggest that there was another son named Nebchaset Nebet, but he is believed to have died in infancy. Obviously, there's not much record of him, so we don't know for sure. We never do see Seti I's wife, but his great royal wife was named Tuya, also known as Mut-Tuya. And since Egyptian pharaohs generally had more than one wife, another one is believed to have been Tanejemet or Tanejemi. And just for fun, there was a British folklorist in the 20th century who strongly believed that she was a reincarnation of an ancient Egyptian priestess who had a romantic relationship with Seti I in a past life. But yeah, obviously mistresses would not really have been written about unless they did something very interesting.
Like murdering the pharaoh.
We see a lot of the Magi with tattoos. Tattoos would have been a very common thing in ancient Egypt. Actually, a lot of them for priestesses and probably priests. But I don't know if the Magi's tattoos are
Historically accurate.
Later in the next scene where we have that kind of crossover with the first movie, Nefertiri is wearing a slightly more accurate dress. However, in Egyptian art, the dresses are actually commonly depicted ending under the breasts. So the breasts would have been revealed. But obviously you can't do that in a PG or PG-13 movie. But at least in this scene, her makeup is a little bit more accurate. I mean, at least the eyeliner is stronger. And I don't know if the tiara is accurate.
They're not really tiaras, they're more crowns, but queens and princesses would regularly wear a piece of headwear called a diadem. And just like styles today, the styles back then would change over the generations. In the 12th dynasty, circa 1991 to 1802 BCE, there were a few pieces that sort of match the one shown in the movie. One that was found is made of interlaced gold wires adorned with almost 200 small flowers inlaid with turquoise and cornelian, which was worn by Princess Kenmet, which was unearthed in Dashur. And there was another circlet from the same dynasty adorned with rosettes and featured the uraeus, the cobra, as a symbol of royalty and protection. More regularly, great royal wives and goddesses would have been depicted wearing the vulture headdress, with the vulture head out at the top, kind of like the uraeus, and wings going down the side, or they'd wear the Hathor crown, with bull horns. And these examples were prominent throughout the dynasties of ancient Egypt, mostly depicted, though, in art. One diadem was even found in the king of Tutankhamun to secure his wig in the 18th dynasty, but none have been found specifically from the 19th dynasty. So scholars are not completely sure exactly what they would have looked like during this period.
In the first movie, they never really did show the back of the room in that intro, but it did have a large curtain in the background, so the closing of the curtain works. They did want it to be as close as possible. It was a good way to disguise the set that they didn't show in the first, which is very sneaky. And it was the same scene, but they had the same throne as the fighting room. So the movie people must have been reusing the set decoration and just taking away some fabric, taking away some snakes, and adding the Bastet statue and just like switching around the set decoration just to make it look a bit more distinct, even though they're probably in the same room. Nefertiti yells at the Magi to help her father, but they're in the courtyard while he and the killers are in the room, probably several stories up, or even at least one story up. It's kind of hard to believe that they got up there so fast. They would have had to run up and start trying to break down the door within about 16 seconds. Very impressive speedrunners. The curtain introduces a new problem, not with, history, but with the plot. The curtain is a little bit see-throughable, but it would have been difficult to actually tell what was happening on the other side. A way that I'd argue that Nefertiti saw Imhotep and Anaxamun kissing. That was before the curtain fell. So she could have been suspicious of them, but then why didn't she call the Magi sooner than after Imhotep took the pharaoh's sword? It could have been similar to how the priest saw what happened in the first movie. I had to rewatch it for this. At least I had to rewatch the intro for this. But the firelight on the back made huge shadows on the curtain. So I guess she could have watched it the same way. There was the problem of the 5 stairs behind Anaxamun don't seem to actually be there in the second movie, so they might have been filming on a different set. Also, just rewatching the first movie, the pharaoh wasn't speaking loudly at all when he came in and was asking why the priests were there. So when it carried so much in the second, it doesn't really make sense. But also, he didn't say Anaxamun while walking through the room in the first movie, but he did say it in the second. And in the second movie, they used the scene from the first movie, but they cut out the part where he points at the smudge on her shoulder and asks about it. So that's kind of weird. Nefertiti obviously reacts to his stabbing and then jumps off the balcony. Did she die? She was also several stories up. I don't know. Maybe that's why she wasn't written about in history. That doesn't really make sense, though. The last thing I'll say about the flashback is that the priests take Imhotep through the curtain to the balcony. How did they escape? In the first movie, I thought that was just another room and there was another way out. But if it was a balcony, there was no other way out. So, confusing. Once they come out of the flashback, Imhotep is wearing the same necklace that he wore in the flashback, which was 4,000 years ago. How is he wearing that necklace? Especially since it still looks so new and fresh. If it was buried somewhere, it should be tarnished, especially since it's metal, and even at least the stone would be dirty. I'm not sure what the cordage is, but he could have just replaced that, I suppose. But more importantly, how did he even find it? He wasn't buried with it. Where would that have been? Plot inconveniences. I wouldn't even say plot holes, but inconvenience. Going back to the heroes, once she calmed down, Evie said that it was her previous life. Why do they look the same? All of them? Being reincarnated wouldn't have meant that you looked anything like the people you were reincarnated from. You might not necessarily be related, although I guess that could be possible, but otherwise, you never could be another race, or gender, or species, which is pretty much against all the major versions of reincarnation from Buddhism, Hinduism, Jainism, Sikhism, Jewish tradition of Kabbalah, plus indigenous and other traditions that have reincarnation. But hey, for movies, it's gotta be cinematic shorthand just so we can recognize the characters that we actually care about. So let's just follow the movie logic. But in the past life, Evie would have been the bracelet's protector. Rick was the Magi who would have protected her family line, and Alex leads the way to Cher. Without each of them playing this exact role, the story could have been very different. Someone else could have put on the bracelet, sure, but then the Scorpion King may have won. The prophecy was, quote, preordained thousands of years ago, unquote, really makes the story feel like a Greek drama, especially. like a Greek drama, a partial comedy from the hero's point of view, but a Greek tragedy if you look at it from the perspectives of either Imhotep or the Scorpion King. But they're evil guys, so it's okay. So the movie goes back to Karnak and shows two palm trees by an open Karnak, with the train that was left right adjacent to it, which actually could be accurate to the actual collection of Egyptian railway company lines, which actually opened up in the 1850s and continued running on the same lines into the 30s and beyond. Of course, they show the train going straight through the desert in some scenes, when the lines were purposely built along the Nile, not in the flood zone, but still. But when they get to Karnak, they don't show a Nile nearby, even though in ancient times, Karnak had quays or quays and ports that would have been on the river. Also, like I mentioned earlier, the movie doesn't even acknowledge that the city of Luxor has been around for a long time, basically under the name of Thebes. Thebes was where the city of Luxor is. And of course, it was still there in the 30s and is still there today. I know, I was there. But while looking at the site's wide shot, we see the line of Amun sphinxes, which is accurate. There are actually dozens, if not at least 100 more Amun sphinxes inside, just like pushed off to the side within the Temple of Karnak, just because originally there were some pharaohs that just made a whole bunch of them and had them around the temple, but later pharaohs did not like that, so they just go like, we don't want to destroy them, but let's just like push them to the side. And I'll have pictures of what that actually looks like today. The wide shot also shows two colossi that are not actually in Karnak or even really close to Karnak, and are actually located on the opposite side of the Nile, on the way to the Valley of the Kings in the west. The CGI of the wide shot omits the huge wall that marks the main entrance, which was definitely there in the 1930s, as it is there today and appears in pictures from the turn of the 19th century. The huge columns that they actually show, a little bit earlier, the first time they show Karnak, are actually further into the temple area. They're not by the entrance, and they did not have huge paintings on them. Like they showed earlier, the hieroglyphs and other carvings, which would have been painted, were stacked in many rows, which we did see. Obviously still ridiculously impressive. There's actually a lot of stela and carvings on the multitude of walls that were way larger. Lastly, I don't remember them having window grates on any of the temples, especially since most of the complex is at least now outside, or rather uncovered. There's not really a lot of roofs left, unless you're in a certain part of Karnak, like the temple for Alexander the Great. That is a solid building, built much later. As they're doing the montage for where Alex is showing that they're going, they follow them to Philae, and when they have that wide shot, I don't actually know the footprint of the actual island of Philae since it's been underwater since the 70s, and I wasn't alive then, but I'm pretty sure it was larger than the one the movie shows, because the real temple, which is now again on a different island, has more buildings on it than are shown in the movie. The Temple of Abu Simbel is the next site they visit, which was built during Ramses the Great, Ramses II's reign, so after Seti I, because he was his son. This site was also built close to the Nile in ancient times. It was built into the mountain by the riverbank, again avoiding the direct flooding zone, but still within a short walking distance. And actually, just like the Temple of Isis, Abu Simbel had to be relocated and was moved 65 meters higher and 200 meters inland into an artificially built hill to save it from being submerged by what would become Lake Nasser when the Aswan High Dam was being built. After Abu Simbel, they go somewhere. There's no name, there's no label, there's no exposition, it's just some desert location. It's weird that they seem to be traveling inland when all the sites were located right along the Nile so far, as most cities were, because people definitely prefer to live within an area that's safe from flooding, but is an easy walk to the water, especially if the alternative is living in a bone-dry desert. In fact, their farms would have been in the inundation plain so that their crops could get water during flooding season. As they're flying through the canyon, Evie says that they were flying over the Blue Nile, which meant that they were out of Egypt by now, and that in ancient times all of this belonged to the Upper Kingdom. That's a pretty period-dependent statement. Nubia, which is a historic region in northeastern Africa, which would have been right under Egypt, along the Nile River, is where Sudan is now, hence the Lake Nubia in Sudan. But around 3500 to 1640 BCE, the people of Egypt had early relations and trade with the A group Nubians, who coexisted with Upper Egypt's Naquita culture. Subsequently, the Kerma civilization emerged as a significant trading hub in Upper Nubia until Egyptian expansion during the Middle Kingdom, when Egypt established territories and forts within the region. During the New Kingdom, 1550 to 1069 BCE, Egypt conquered Nubia, leading to extensive cultural assimilation and the integration of Nubians into the Egyptian military, notably the Magi. During the 25th dynasty and the Kushite period, so 747 to 656 BCE, Nubian kings of Kush successfully conquered Egypt, with pharaohs like Paye, Shabaka, and Taharka ruling a unified Egyptian-Nubian empire. Later, during the Greco-Roman period, so 300 BCE to 300 CE, northern Nubia became part of Greco-Roman Egypt, while the Meroitic kingdom prospered further south. What ancient times is she talking about? I'm sure she's speaking in general for the audience for simplicity's sake. They're going through a canyon, but just looking at the movie, where the heck is a waterfall crashing down into the Nile? Oh, right, there isn't. There aren't. At least not in Egypt, not in Sudan. Therefore, not in where Nubia was. The only two natural waterfalls on the Nile, so we're not counting where the dams are,
or the cataracts,
are the Murchison Falls in the Victoria Nile in Uganda and the Blue Nile Falls in Ethiopia. But both of them are part of the one Nile River. It doesn't branch off from each other.
where the waterfalls fall. But it does split. They would have turned to the southeast to get to the Blue Nile as opposed to the White Nile, which flows from the southwest.
Where is that other water coming from? Also, it's the desert. I mean, even if it's not the desert, it's a canyon, it's a plateau. There's no snowfall in Sudan. Geologically, geographically, that waterfall makes no sense. And they flow north, just like the rest of the river. The movie, however, flips the river's direction. The Nile flows from Upper Egypt to Lower Egypt, so named because it runs from the mountains in the south, where Upper Egypt is, to the Delta and the Mediterranean Sea in the north. The airship is following the river, which would mean that they'd be going north, while all the sites have been taking them further and further south. And it is accurately following the trajectory, which is now why they're flying over Sudan, south of Egypt. And then, how does the airship get further downriver from Imhotep's party without either one of the parties seeing it? And, I mean, if Imhotep's party did see it, which could be why Imhotep knows to send the giant wave of the Nile downriver at the heroes, why is Alex making a randomly elaborate arrow in the sand? They already passed them. Anyway, once the heroes make it to the oasis, which in reality oases weren't so big or very jungly, but you can hear monkeys. And that's actually kind of cool that they were included, not just because it's a jungle environment, because that's not really accurate for that area, but because monkeys were actually traded from Nubia and from further south into Egypt as pets. And like baboons, especially, were prized as rare and expensive mummies. Specifically, the sacred baboon was deeply revered. They were partially associated with the sun god Ra, and they were primary sacred animals of Thoth, or Toth, the god of wisdom, knowledge, writing, and the moon. They were mummified, and living ones were kept in colonies at temples. Isotope testing on mummified baboons confirms that the Egyptians imported these revered animals directly from regions spanning present-day Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Somalia. I mean, real ones, that is. Actually, many of the baboon mummies from around the Middle Kingdom onward could have been one of the intermediate periods too, but many of the mummy baboons traded to Egypt were actually fakes, with heads carved from wood and the body stuffed with vegetation with a jar in the middle. And we didn't actually know this until we did x-ray scans. While these might have been like sacrilegious in some sense, because they weren't real baboons and they kind of would have tricked the Egyptians, possibly, but maybe not, because the creation of art on tomb walls and little ushabtis become real in the afterlife. So maybe the baboons would have come to life as well and then fulfilled their purpose in the field of reeds. But in the movie, they've made it to Amshir. This is the oasis. It is literally along the Nile. You'd think that it would have been much easier to find and get to. After all, people were constantly trading up and down the Nile for thousands of years. If it were real, the only explanation that I can think of is that this is the segment of the Nile that doesn't flow north. The river briefly actually flows southwest through the Sahara Desert, and it is famously known as the Great Bend of the Nile, which is in northern Sudan, so it can check out. It is one of several features formed by tectonic uplift over millions of years, driven by a large underground rock formation known as the Nubian Swell. The area was supposedly a cursed land, or just really mystically dangerous, because it wasn't following the right cosmological order by changing direction. The Nile was supposed to flow north, always. In the movie, this could be an explanation why ancient Egyptians didn't go, but not all in more recent history. It would have been nuts if everyone who traveled up the Nile was never seen or heard from again. People did go through it in real life. Where would the kingdom of Punt have been that Hatshepsut sent trading emissaries to? They obviously made it to Punt and made it back, although it was a real place. But even today, scholars have no solid theory on where Punt actually is. And gosh, it's so cute that Ardith Bay named his falcon Horus after the falcon god. It's just so sad that the bird gets shot. And obviously, I mean, it's a jungle, and just in general, there are bats everywhere. But I really wanted to look it up. There are several species of bats. These bats could be the Egyptian tomb bats, but this is a widespread desert species known for roosting in ancient structures and in tombs along the Nile. There's the Egyptian fruit bat, a highly social bat found in deep human caves and historic ruins. There's the lampet-eared free-tailed bat, a species hailing from the 5th cataract of the Nile in northern Sudan, so again, this would check out. There's also the naked rumped tomb bat, a insectivorous bat that frequently takes residence in deep spaces of ancient Egyptian ruins. But yeah, Rick said that they were out of Egypt, so them and the people on the ground would have had to cross into Sudan, meaning they would have had to go through a long zigzag border crossing at the Egypt-Sudan border that runs through the Nile River at the Wadi Halfa salient around the 22nd parallel. During this period, prior to Sudan's independence in 1956, The region was governed as the Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, an arrangement in which the British administrators effectively managed the border between the two nations, preventing international disputes. If they had to cross this border, there probably had to be a lot of paperwork involved, but for a movie that's too slow, boring, and time-consuming, so obviously they skipped it. In the jungle, you see the Roman soldier's crest with an eagle within a circle. And I know those are the Roman soldier's crest because the curator does say Roman legionnaires. They also point out Napoleon's troops. So I guess they did find the oasis after all. They just never made it back, like apparently everyone else. There are also skeletons in cages. Did the mummy creatures make those? I mean, they are adept at using tools. But also, like, when I was a kid, I always thought those were monkey mummies. And it wasn't until a lot later, not on this watch, but years ago, that I was like, wait, are those supposed to be people? Are they supposed to be pygmies? They don't have tails. I mean, monkeys are intelligent, but how intelligent are they? They put skulls on stakes, which is definitely a human thing. And Jonathan does say, what are those pygmy things? Though, I guess I thought those could just refer to their size.
Pretty messed up if you think about it.
The characters see shrunken heads. That is a different place in the world.
Found in the Amazon rainforest of Ecuador and Peru, the real shrunken heads, known as tzanzas, were exclusively crafted by the Shuar and related Ivaroan tribes, including the Shuar and Aguaruna, by warriors who took the enemy heads as war trophies to harness the victim's spiritual power.
I mean, it does show up in the Disneyland Jungle Cruise, but that was also a weird mix of different places in any jungle of the world. So, the headhunters, another thing that they put into Pirates of the Caribbean, actually, in the third movie. Keeping moving forward, Evie's aim is way too good at that distance with a rifle from the 1930s or before. And skipping to the end of this whole section, because it's mostly just action, the sun would not rise that quickly, and if lighting on the ground was like that, it would have already hit the top of the pyramid. So, oops. But they had to make it more dramatic, of course. It is a nice touch at the pyramid with the Anubis statues laid out like the Amun statues at Karnak, since Anubis' magic would have created the oasis and pyramid, so it's honoring him. If the power was just going to be taken away from Imhotep, why did he need to be the one to do it? But also, why didn't the pygmies attack the mummy or Anaxamun? They weren't protected by the bracelet? Maybe just he had magic and he looked scary? I don't know. Another question is, why did the bracelet hole eat the guy's arm flesh? If that had been Alex, who stuck his hand in there, hot damn. Or if it was a person who was planning to fight the Scorpion King, that would have been a huge hindrance. Basically, the hero needs to bring a patsy. The stork is not a metaphys. Poor Rock with this not great CGI. I guess the budget was spent on the Anubis army, adding wide shots, and adding money to practical shots, so not enough for the Rock.
The stork isn't a metaphys. In ancient Egypt, the stork symbol was used to represent the Ba, which means one of the parts of the human soul or spiritual power. In other words, in the ancient Egyptian writing system, this bird served as a direct symbol for the soul and was used to represent the sound Ba. The specific bird used in the early drawings was the saddle-billed stork, which is listed as sign G29 in standard hieroglyphic catalogs. The stork is one of the oldest symbols in Egyptian history, appearing in large rock carvings dating back more than 5,000 years. Archaeologists found some of these early stork symbols in the desert of Elqab, where they were carved next to ibises to represent the movement of the sun and cosmic light. But as time passed, the saddle-billed stork died out in the northern Nile region. Because artists could no longer see the real bird, their drawings changed. During the Old Kingdom, royal scribes began depicting the stork with more of a shorter neck and beak, which ended up making it look like a common goose, even though the symbol's spiritual meaning never actually changed.
In the climax of the movie, when Rick is going to fight the Scorpion King, the scepter becomes a spear, which is learned from the carving on the wall. The guy in that carving is wearing the Nemes crown, like a pharaoh would. He has a tattoo, but it is on his left arm. Rick has it on his right, but let's ignore that. The Magi wore crowns somewhat similar to the Nemes crown, but they weren't striped, they were just black. Are they trying to differentiate the special prophecy one? Are they saying that he is more special? If it was just any Magi, couldn't any one of them have saved the world? I mean, if they weren't all fighting the Anubis soldiers. But after Rick stabs the Scorpion King and an Imhotep says, "Nye!" the dramatic "Nye" is amazing. They have the river crack. Is it supposed to be the underworld? Is it supposed to be like hell? Or the river Styx, which was also not a hell. It was just what you had to cross to get to the afterlife in ancient Greece. But even then, the river Styx, you would forget your life. So you had to take a dip in it to forget and to have another one. Anyway, Styx is Greece, and Egyptians didn't have a hell. If you were a bad person, you'd fail the test of the heart-weighing ceremony, and like I said before, your soul, the Ka or Ba, would have been devoured by a moot, and you just cease to exist. Which begs the question, if they could ensure that Imhotep would be devoured because he was obviously a bad person, and he would fail the heart-weighing ceremony, why did they curse him in the first place? He would have just ceased to exist, and I guess they just needed him to be tortured. They needed a movie. But going back to the actual movie here, Rick discovers that he is a Magi warrior, supposedly discovers that he is the reincarnation of the legendary Magi warrior who defeated the Scorpion King, but no one ever defeated the Scorpion King before. Anubis just took him. He was never beaten. So he was the prophesied new guy? So how would the true meaning and importance of his tattoo actually work? Because, like I said earlier, the tattoo is something that all Magi have. Oh well, it's the prophecy of the movie. I love when Evie goes to save Rick. I love that. And I feel a little bit sad when Anaxamun abandons Imhotep, and then he just gives up. A little twinge. But she does get what she deserves, though, because she's eaten by scarabs. A little harsh, but dang. And of course, the heroes are rescued. They get the diamond treasure, which is basically just celebrating the rich getting richer. I mean, they're English, but they are half Egyptian, but they're still half white imperialistic, and it's not like they're gonna leave the diamond with the Egyptian Museum in Cairo like they should. Like, all following the prophecy.
I want to sincerely apologize for all of my ridiculous pronunciations of words, of names, in any language, including English, and I really appreciate your patience with me. I babble incessantly about all the problems that I had with it, and just talk about the movie a bit, although a lot of it is cut out and will be on the blooper reel that I'll put out next Saturday. All the background music comes from Scott Buckley and can be found at scottbuckley.com.au. If there's anything that I missed that you want to draw attention to, if there's anything, any facts that I got wrong, please let me know. We all want to learn the right things, so I definitely encourage involvement. You can leave a comment on this video if you're watching it on YouTube, on the podcast if you're listening, wherever you're listening to your podcasts. You can also email me directly at detoursandarchaeology@gmail.com, and and I can call it out in my next episode. You can also find and follow me on Blue Sky. You can join my Patreon for free. I have a Discord that is also under the name Detours in Archaeology. Or you can follow me on Instagram for more artistic shots and a lot of random field stuff. More travel shots and nature shots. At Flying Sepida, the scientific name for cuttlefish, Sepida. I want to sincerely apologize for all of my ridiculous pronunciations of words, of names, in any language, including English, and I really appreciate your patience with me. Please like, subscribe, and share this episode or any other episode with your friends, with your enemies, or with random people that you don't actually know. That is the best way to help me grow, and I'd really, really appreciate it. For the fun fact this week, I have some cool news, so I decided to talk about pirates. These are facts and myths about pirates by Cynthia Barnes from interestingfacts.com. Quoted, "Ahoy, mateys! Everyone knows that in addition to making an excellent costume for Halloween and Renaissance fairs, pirates are pretty fun, at least in their Disney-fied state with parrots, rum, jewels, and gold. However, a lot of the modern stereotypes about pirates just don't hold water. Here are a few facts about pirates that won't get you cast out to sea." It's really going for the puns here. Shiver me timbers, pirates didn't actually go around saying "arr" or "ahoy, mateys." In fact, they probably spoke more or less just like other sailors at the time. We can blame the pirate accent on Hollywood. Actor Robert Newton gave an influential performance as Long John Silver in the 1950 Disney adaptation of Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, which itself was the source of much, often inaccurate, modern-day pirate lore. Newton based his pirate speak on the dialect of the West Country in southwestern England, where he hailed from, and where Long John Silver comes from in the book. But don't let the facts get in the way on September 19th, which is International Talk Like a Pirate Day. Pirates didn't make treasure maps. This is another myth from Treasure Island, not that we wouldn't all enjoy finding a chest filled with gold doubloons. Although Captain Kidd did bury some booty on New York's Gardner Island, most pirates spent or sold the fruits of their quote-unquote labor pretty quick. To date, there has never been a single case of an authentic pirate map resulting in a treasure find. However, in the golden age of piracy, accurate maps were rare and valuable, and were considered a natural treasure all on their own. Most pirates didn't have peg legs. Piracy is a pretty rough business, and swords are sharp and pointy, so the occasional eye patch isn't improbable on a pirate. As an addition, pirates would wear eye patches over one eye so they could still have their vision in the dark below decks. But while amputations wouldn't be unheard of on an unsanitary ship, the trope of pirates sporting wooden legs is almost entirely a literary convention. Also, until next time, stay curious, stay inspired, and keep taking those detours. Thanks. Perhaps French privateer Francois Leclerc. 2 one-legged exceptions to the rule. And finally, the skull and crossbones flag was real. Pirate ships did actually fly the Jolly Roger, a black flag featuring a skull and crossbones, which was intended to strike fear in the hearts of all who saw it. Although they'd originally approached their victims under a friendly flag and just switch it to the black banner, or sometimes a red one, announcing their plundering intentions. One theory links the name Jolly Roger to Satan, as Old Roger was a common 18th century nickname for the devil. Not all pirate flags look quite like this, though, some incorporating bleeding hearts, an hourglass, or other fearsome insignia. The last fact that I wanted to add is that there's only been one pirate ship that has ever been found with treasure on it. As I said before, most pirates would have spent their treasure, their loot, their booty rather quickly rather than burying it. However, the most notable discoverer of pirate treasure, and really the only discovery of pirate treasure underwater, was on the Whydah galley, which sunk off the coast of Cape Cod in 1717. There's over 200,000 artifacts that have been found, including gold, cannons, and tens of thousands of coins. And my news is that I will be working on this site and in the lab. Yes, that is true. I am moving to Massachusetts to work in the museum and to work on the site, and I am extremely excited. So thank you again for listening to this episode of Detours in Archaeology.
Next time, video games, and I'll be looking at the newest reboot of Tomb Raider. So I'll start with the Island of Himiko. If you know any fun facts about that, please send them my way. I'd love to hear about it. If you know anything about the video game, love to learn. We can all learn together. Until next time, stay curious, stay inspired, and keep taking those detours. Thanks.